Hello, everyone. I am Sarah Hubbard, Grant Training Coordinator for the National Children's Advocacy Center and the host of today's webinar. Thank you for joining today's presentation entitled Sources of Error in Children's Testimony, presented by Jason Dickinson. Dr. Jason J. Dickinson is an Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of the Robert D. McCormick Center of Child Advocacy and Policy at Montclair State University. His research with Deborah Poole on the use of interviewing aids in forensic interviews has been supported by several grants from the National Science Foundation. Their work on human figure drawings, which are body diagrams, have been published in Child Abuse and Neglect and the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology. Their latest work on human figure drawings was recently accepted by the publication in Law and Human Behavior. In March of this year, they delivered 2 workshops at the NCAC's 2016 conference titled International Symposium on Child Abuse. The title of what they had was The Use of Interviewing Aids to Facilitate Children's Eyewitness Testimony, Practice, Research, and Policy, and the 3 C's of Forensic Interviewing, the developmental science behind the subtleties. In June of this year, Jason delivered a webinar for the NCAC on the use of human figure drawings in forensic interviews. He regularly consults with the interviewing and legal communities to help translate research into public policy and inform investigative. To you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here and happy to be speaking with you today. And I'd like to thank NCAC, Linda and Andra, and Sarah Hubbard, who helped put this together for me. I'm thrilled to be back again. As Sarah mentioned, I gave a webinar in June on the use of human figure drawings. And today I'm going to be talking about suggestibility and sources of error in children's testimony. So we'll take some questions at the end. I'll try to leave some time for that. So before we begin, I'm going to start with a couple of survey questions for you. It's going to kind of frame our conversation today and provide some context. Here's the first question. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how suggestible are children, in your opinion? All right, so it looks like I'm assuming everyone can see the results there. It looks like we're all over the place a little bit. Most of you, the mode is 5, so most of you are right in the middle. And most of us are, I suppose, somewhere between 5 and 10. So keep that those results in mind, and also think about where you fell on that continuum when we go to the next question here, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, how much prompting do you feel children need to disclose? 10 being the most. Okay. So again, actually the mode here is, we have a tie between 3 and 5. So most of us are between 3 and 5 there in terms of how much prompting we think children need to disclose. So 10 being the most, so the tendency is that children don't need a terrible amount of prompting to disclose. In other words, children tend to be fairly forthcoming. And the reason I bring this up is because, actually we're ready for the next slide. I guess I can click it. Kind of where you fall in these two continuum are going to kind of drive your interviewing style when questioning children. And Poole and I in 2005 published a commentary on a research article. We talked about the future of the protocol movement, and we put up this this quadrant here, this kind of two-dimensional quadrant of that looks at the horizontal axis here is where you fall in terms of do you think children are suggestive, and whether or not suggestive techniques tend to elicit false reports or not. And on the horizontal axis really speaks to whether people think children need prompting to disclose abuse or not, or prodding. And as you can see, kind of where you fall in that continuum, you may fall in quadrant A, B, C, or D. I think most people probably fall in quadrant B. Children often need prodding to discuss abuse. Suggestive techniques can elicit inaccurate information, and use direct questions and aids, but avoid more suggestive techniques. I think that probably a lot of folks probably fall in quadrant B. So certainly you can see, looking at this quadrant, where certainly there's a more conservative interviewing style and a more liberal interviewing style, and it really comes down to balancing how suggestible do you think children are, and whether or not suggestive techniques actually elicit false reports, and to what extent do you believe that children need prodding to discuss abuse. And so the interviewing style that you engage in, I think, or that most people engage in, is kind of made up of these two dimensions. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as we go forward when we talk about suggestibility. And when we talk about suggestibility, I'm going to use the standard definition. It's the extent that post-event information after the fact, after an event, can influence memory, including the storage, retrieval, and reporting of events. So by now, everyone knows that, like adults, even young children are capable of providing detailed and coherent narratives about experienced events, but that also, like adults, children are suggestible. And in the face of highly suggestive questioning, children are capable of providing both fantastic allegations, but also detailed and convincing descriptions of non-experienced events, including accounts of touching to their bodies. But it wasn't that long ago that many professionals believed that children could not be led or coached to make false allegations regarding abuse. And early research on children's testimony countered these beliefs by demonstrating that an array of interviewing techniques could, in fact, elicit false reports, including leading or suggestive questions, right? Repeated questions, stereotype induction, right? Casting the suspect in a negative light, the use of peer pressure, encouraging speculation or imagination, promises or reinforcement for desired answers, expressing disbelief or disappointment, and in some cases, interviewing aids such as puppets, toys, and dolls. Now, all of these techniques have been found to generate error in children's testimony. So yes, we know that highly suggestive techniques can generate false reports. And so again, the early research on suggestibility really looked at some of the case features in these early daycare cases and demonstrated that yes, using these egregious suggestive interviewing techniques could in fact elicit accounts of things that never happened. So now the research has kind of shifted from very suggestive interviewing techniques to how does suggestibility affect children's reporting, even when good interviewing techniques are used. In other words, what about pre-interview influences on children's testimony? And the reason that I bring this up is because I've seen some national trainings in children's interviewing and suggestibility where in a week-long course they'll spend an hour talking about children's suggestibility, and they'll talk about research that took place 30 years ago, the mousetraps, C.C. and Bruck's the mousetrap study, for example, and they'll, the trainings will say, well, we don't ask real suggestive questions anymore. That was a long time ago, so therefore we don't need to worry about suggestibility anymore. And I think that is short-sighted. What we're going to be talking about today is we're not going to be talking about suggestive interviewing techniques per se, but we're going to be talking about sources of error in children's testimony that can occur before children even walk into your interview room. And I'm going to talk about how even mild suggestions can lead children to generate convincing reports of non-experienced events, including touching. And I'm also going to talk about a recent study I conducted where children were led to report non-touching. In other words, after exposure to misinformation, some children reported not being touched when in fact they were. And I'm actually going to show you some video clips. So the factors affecting children's testimony are often divided into two categories: external influences, such as interviewing techniques, and internal influences, such as memory and language. So I want to talk about adult influence and external factor as our starting point. And when I talk about adult influence, I'm talking about memory contamination that occurs prior to the interview through coaching or even well-intentioned and seemingly benign conversations with children, or unofficial or informal interviews conducted by concerned parents. And this is one way that things can start to go astray and lead to errors in children's testimony. And so as an example, consider this book. Wait a minute. There we go. So this is a book that's available on Amazon.com. It's called Something Happened and I'm Scared to Tell. With the help of a friendly lion, a young sexual abuse victim is able to talk about sexual abuse and recover self-esteem. So this is an abuse book, and this is something that you might read to a victim of sexual abuse. And this is what one of the reviewers had to say about the book on Amazon. I don't know if you can read that, but here is that's just a screenshot of the text, but here's actually what the reviewer said. I recently adopted 2 young children and began to suspect that they had been sexually abused. My preschool daughter even underwent a forensic examination but did not disclose anything. I read them this book, however, and it sparked discussion about sex and what happens during sex that led them to disclosing the very serious abuse they underwent. So I don't know if these kids were, in this case, first of all, this is a review on Amazon, so you have to take, it's the internet, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. But maybe these children were abused, maybe they weren't. I have no way of knowing. But what I do know is that the parent's account of her effort to confirm her suspicions raises a number of troubling questions. So going back to her original suspicion, what can the research tell us about children's sexual and non-sexual behavior that could potentially spark suspicion of abuse among adults, such as parents or teachers, right? Because she says that she began to suspect that they'd been sexually abused. So what was happening here? Were they acting out? Were they having nightmares? Were they wetting the bed? Were they fighting? Were they doing poorly in school? These are all things that apparently, or at least could have aroused suspicion in this adopted parent that her children had been sexually abused. So again, what does the research tell us about children's normative sexual behavior? My colleague Deb Poole and Poole and Wolf 2009 published a great chapter in a book. The reference is at the end of the presentation where they summarize the research on children's normative sexual behavior. So that's a really great resource if you haven't seen that already. But sometimes concerns about abuse may arise through misunderstandings about developmental trends in sexual and non-sexual behaviors. And at any given time, a typical child has a long list of behaviors that could become the object of focus if there is concern about abuse. So 2- and 6-year-olds frequently express sexual curiosity, act uninhibited about their bodies, and touch themselves. Poole and Wolf cite one study where 22% of boys and 16% of girls in one sample had been seen masturbating. 26% of boys, 18% of girls had shown sexual body parts to adults, and 36% of boys and 19% of girls had touched their parts in public. As children get older, many of their overt sexual curiosities and behaviors decline and become more private, but other behaviors such as sexual play, like playing doctor, can go underground and take place at a public view. Sexual play among children is relatively common, and that, of course, doesn't mean that sexual play shouldn't be corrected or even punished, but certainly it's relatively common. The mean age of reported sexual experiences involving 2 or more children ranges from 7.5 to 9 years of age. And in one retrospective study cited in this chapter, 42% of respondents reported a sexual encounter with another child before age 13. So regarding non-sexual behaviors, they can be prompted by abuse, but are more often associated with normal developmental issues such as medical problems and disruptions in family routines or other stressors. Whoops. I don't know where the other slide went, but we lost a slide here. So these other stressors include sleep-related problems, or these other behaviors include sleep-related problems, toileting problems, somatic complaints, concerns about eating, tics, rituals, and fears. So those are all normative non-sexual behaviors that could potentially give rise to concerns about abuse. So it's important to know, have some idea of what's normal when it comes to, at least normative when it comes to sexual and non-sexual behaviors in children. And really, Poole and Wolf conclude in the chapter that sexual behavior is not a particularly strong indicator of sexual abuse. So it is a mistake to assume that most children who engage in inappropriate sexual behavior were sexually abused. The majority of sexual behavior occurs among non-abused children simply because sexual behavior is common, and there are more non-abused than abused children. On the other hand, the absence of such behaviors should not be taken to mean a child has not been abused. Many children who were sexually abused show no behaviors that alarm or alert adults. And that is from Poole and Wolf's chapter. Again, there's an excellent resource discussing normative sexual behavior that could give rise to suspicions of abuse. So we just got done talking about sexual behaviors, and now I want to talk about peer influence, right? Influence from other children. And some of you are probably familiar with Gabby Principe's research. Some of you may not, but I'm quickly going to go through a couple of her studies, which are really clever laboratory studies looking at the influence of peers and parents on children's eyewitness testimony. So they've conducted a number of studies demonstrating that children will report misinformation acquired from peers and later forensic-style interviews. So in this study, their 2012 study, children watched a magic show. Let me click here. And at the end of the magic show, the magician tried to pull a rabbit out of the hat, but the rabbit, wasn't there. It was a failed trick, right? And the magician made it seem like, that the rabbit was supposed to be there, but the rabbit wasn't. So after the magic show, children were assigned to one of 3 conditions. Children in the overheard condition heard 2 adults talking about the rabbit, the loose rabbit in the school. whereas children in the classmate condition only mingled afterwards with these children, and then children in the control group did not hear the rumor or interact with children who had. So again, the real target condition here it all started with this rumor where children heard some adults talking about how there was a rabbit loose in the school. So the table that you see here, scroll through, the table that you see here reports findings from a 4-week delay for kids 5 and 6 years old. And as in other studies, few children in the control group who had not been exposed to the rumor reported the falsehood, and false reports that did occur were in response to specific questions. The picture was different, though, for children who had overheard the rumor or who had interacted with misinformed peers. Nearly all of the children reported the rumor. Some volunteered elaborate narratives about fictitious events, like the rabbit bit my finger or bit my foot, and a substantial percentage of the children's narratives could be traced directly to conversations amongst peers. So there is some fairly strong evidence from the laboratory that rumors amongst peers can influence children's reports. And real quick, I'm going to talk about another study that Gabriel Principe did. And this study used the same magic show paradigm, but here the study looked at misinformation from parents on children's testimony. So there were 117 3 to 5-year-old children who had watched the magic show with the failed trick. The day before the interview about the magic show, the parents had received a letter asking them to question their child in a natural manner. In the misinformation condition, mothers were told that a rabbit may have gotten loose and they should question their children about it or about the possibility of the rabbit getting loose. In the neutral condition, the instructions were the same, but there was no mention of the trick. And in the control condition, parents were not given a letter and did not discuss the show with their children. And after these conversations with parents, the children were interviewed by an interviewer who was naive to which condition the children were in. And the results. So the table here reports the proportions and counts of children who reported the target activity during the interview across conditions. And you can see that in the suggestive condition, more than half the children reported seeing the loose rabbit during the interview, and those who did so in the neutral and control questions did so in response to leading questions. So in sum, right, so the results clearly demonstrate that misinformation provided by parents can seep into children's later reports. And if you look at the pattern of results here, it also demonstrates that open-ended questions do not necessarily mitigate the effects of suggestibility. So those are two studies that have looked at peer and parent influence on children's testimony. And now I briefly want to talk about another study. This is actually a series of studies conducted by Deb Poole and Steve Lindsay, 1995, 2001. And this is important to kind of go through this because there are some really interesting findings to come out of this research. And also, I'm going to talk about a study that I recently did on it using a variation of this paradigm, and I'm going to show you a couple of video clips of children making false reports. But in the original Mr. Science paradigm, the children come into the lab and they participate in 4 science demonstrations, and half of the children are touched on the wrist, and half of the children are not. 3 months later, the parents read a book 3 times prior to a final interview, and the book contains accounts of experienced and non-experienced demonstrations, and for some children, the book talks about accounts of non-experienced touching. And again, I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit in a minute. After exposure to misinformation through the book, children come back to the laboratory and are interviewed, or in some cases, the interviewers went out to their homes and interviewed them there. So there were some general findings to emerge from these studies that I kind of want to go through. Responses to open-ended questions. So for children who, this is under optimal conditions, for children who've not been exposed to suggestive influences, these are some general trends in responses to open-ended questions. It's not unusual for children to say nothing about target events even after they've just happened. So a lot of children will say nothing about events even after the events just took place. And even young children, sometimes older children, will say nothing, whereas some young children are very chatty and some old children are very chatty. During the preschool years, there's a large increase in the amount of information that children volunteer, and all children benefit from open-ended questions. Young children have more difficulty staying on topic, so a higher proportion of information is off-topic and confusing. Children of all ages have about the same low rate of detail error, but it is not uncommon for reports to contain errors that might mislead investigators. And finally, reports elicited on multiple occasions often contain little overlapping information, especially with young children. Okay, but what about open-ended responses to open-ended questions after children have been exposed to suggestive influences by parents? Children in general were highly accurate when adults had not contaminated their reports, but children were highly inaccurate when adults had contaminated their reports. And these really comport with the general consensus that children can be very accurate in reporting events when they've not been exposed to suggestive influences. There was no tendency for children to report more, for younger children to report more false information than older children, and no differences between touch and non-touch events in terms of reporting suggested events. So in sum, well actually let me go back real quick. I apologize. So that was responses to open-ended questions after exposure to suggestibility, but what about specific questions? It's typical for children's accuracy to decline for specific questions. We're talking about WH questions, who, what, why, where, when, for example, especially yes-no questions. And why is that? Because interviewers, when they ask specific questions, are more likely to ask about events, details that the children never experienced, never encoded, or may have forgotten. And it's risky to assume that specific questions are okay for central events. Children sometimes respond to questions they did not understand or cannot factually answer in an effort to be cooperative. That certainly is something I think that most people are aware of. And in sum, the results of these studies do not support the assumption that information reported in free recall is highly accurate. Older children are always more resistant to suggestion than are younger children. Suggestibility procedures must be intense to produce a high degree of false information. And the results from these studies also do not report the assumption that touching experiences enjoy special resistance to suggestion. I'll also add that there's kind of this, right, we know that free recall questions are good, right? Narrative prompts are good. We hear that, quite often. There's no guarantee, of course, that responses to open-ended questions are necessarily going to be accurate. We know that they're again, more likely to be accurate, but more likely to be sketchy compared to specific questions. But exposure to misinformation can also influence children's responses to open-ended questions. So I'm going to talk about a recent study that, a pilot study we did in my lab, where we combined the original Mr. Science paradigm that Poole and Lindsay used with our germ detective paradigm that Deb and I have been using in the lab recently. And what we did is we brought 24 kids into the lab, ages 4 to 6. And prior to seeing our Mr. Science assistant, they were told that Mr. Science was not supposed to touch their skin, and that if he touched their skin, he should break a rule, and they should remind him that he broke a rule. And so the children did 4 science demonstrations about germs and how to stay healthy. And Mr. Science touched all of the children's faces to get water off their face. So he touched all of their faces. And then at the end of the session, he went to shake their hand. But right before he shook their hand, he pulled his hand back and said, "I almost broke a rule. I'm not supposed to touch you." So again, the face touch was delivered and the hand touch was not delivered. And then we sent the book home with parents, and the parents, this was 2 weeks later, the parents read the book to the children, and they read it once a day on 2 days prior to coming back for an interview. And I'm going to show you what was contained in the book, and it was a very short narrative about their visit to the laboratory. And so the book contains 2 accounts of experienced science demonstrations and 2 accounts of non-experienced science demonstrations, and the accounts of the face and hand touch were reversed. In other words, the book talked about how Mr. Science went to touch the child's face, but the child did not allow it, and Mr. Science went to shake their hand, and they did in fact shake their hand. So again, their exposure to misinformation was exactly opposite of what they experienced. And again, they returned for 2 weeks. The interview, there was an introduction, a practice narrative, some ground rules. There was a free recall narrative section. We asked some specific questions and some source monitoring questions and some impossible questions. All right. And this gives you an idea of what the manipulation looked like. So it's a very subtle manipulation. It's not, there's a misconception of the suggestibility research that even today's research, that the laboratory research is really hitting children over the head with suggestibility. And it's simply not true. So in the short narrative here, the short story that the parents read to children, it's important to point out that we don't explicitly say these things happen. This is just a story that they read to their kid that contains some contextual information. The misinformation manipulation is actually quite small. So you see here I've highlighted in red, next Mr. Science said, "Good job, thank you for helping me today," and shook Sophie's hand. And after shaking her hand, Sophie said to Mr. Science, "No shaking hands." She reminded Mr. Science he's not supposed to touch children's skin because we don't want him to spread germs. The text highlighted there in red on the left is the account about the face touch. And Sophie is I just inserted that name. I'm going to show you a couple of clips. Neither of these kids are named Sophie. So that's our manipulation. Sarah, you want to show video 1?
Yes, so I'm going to on right now. Let me just get it large enough for everybody to see.
And this child is 5 years old. Do I hit play?
Okay, I've got one more question for you. Did someone try to touch you when you came to play Germ Detective?
No.
Did someone touch you when you came to play Germ Detective?
No.
Okay. When you came to play Germ Detective, did Mr. Science touch your face?
No.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm assuming everybody caught that at the end. So I asked him some yes/no questions about what happened, whether or not someone tried to touch him or touch his face during Germ Detective. And keep in mind that his face was touched, and the account in the book said it wasn't. And you could see him clearly, right? He's saying no, but he's pointing to his face. So it's not simply the suggestive, his false report his false negative of not being touched is not simply due to his lack of memory. So it's a really interesting clip. It also kind of demonstrates that yes, no questions are just not great questions. Sarah, you want to play the second clip, please?
Yes. Let me move that one over.
And then Mr. Science said that there was a little bit of water on my face, and then he said he'll take it off, but I didn't let him because otherwise he'll spread germs.
Okay, so that's another clip of a false negative. What's interesting about that clip is that her narrative there is almost verbatim out of the book that her parents read to her. So, I mean, what this demonstrates is that, again, suggestibility does not have to be strong to influence children's reports. It's a fairly mild suggestibility manipulation, and it is enough to distort children's reports amongst a significant number of children. So far we've seen how pre-interview misinformation can influence children's reports even with open-ended questions. Unfortunately, trying to determine the extent, actually can we pull the video off and go to the next slide? Trying to determine the extent of children's exposure to pre-interview information is very difficult. Research has found that asking adults to recall the details of their conversations is kind of fruitless. Adults have difficulty remembering whether children's statements and conversations were spontaneous or whether they were elicited through leading questions. And they have difficulty remembering who brought up what information. But generally speaking, parents are good at recalling the gist, so they have poor information for how that information was elicited. Trained interviewers are poor at retrospectively judging the quality of their interviews. And we also know that even verbatim notes by interviewers contain serious inaccuracies. So trying to reconstruct conversations after the fact is not a great way to, unfortunately, identify pre-interview sources of suggestibility. Certainly more research needs to be done on how to talk to witnesses in these cases to determine what was said and who said it. So now I'm going to talk about some individual difference variables. Neurological immaturity, and these are internal factors that can affect children's reports, and I'm going to talk about these fairly briefly. Cognitive control, skills that guide goal-directed behavior. So cognitive control is very similar to, sometimes used synonymously with, the executive function. So the neural foundations for cognitive control are in place in early development, but they're not yet invoked quickly or efficiently. Cognitive control improves dramatically across childhood and adolescence, and lack of cognitive control produces interesting parallels between children's behavior and adults with brain damage or certain neurological conditions. Sorry, I'm not keeping pace with what I'm saying here. So executive function for cognitive control involves a lot of different things, right? One of those things is source monitoring, and many of you know what source monitoring is. It's the ability or the process of specifying when, where, and how something was learned, identifying the origin of your memory, and I'm not going to talk about the external, internal, or reality monitoring differences, but suffice it to say that there are greatest gains in source monitoring ability between 3 and 8 years old, but performance continues to increase. So source monitoring is tied to cognitive control, and that's a serious concern when it comes to children's testimony. For example, the clip of the boy you saw pointing to his face, that's an example of failure to identify the source of your memory. Young children, compared to adults, also have a propensity for false recognitions. Frequent errors saying yes, I heard or saw something, or saying yes when you're presented with novel stimuli. Younger children are more likely than older children to display a yes bias in response to yes-no recognition questions, especially when questions are incomprehensible. And more frequent, false recognitions are more frequent when questions mention information that is easily confused with experienced events. Young children who lack cognitive control also are more likely to confabulate. Confabulation is the scientific word for a false memory or memory distortion. And a confabulation is different than deception. So a confabulation is a legitimate memory error. And of course, we know that sometimes children can interject fantastic elements into their descriptions of events. Confabulations can sometimes be plausible, or sometimes they can be clear inventions. And confabulations are probably responsible for wild allegations we saw in daycare cases, and probably exacerbated by asking children to speculate or use their imagination. Other performance issues tied to cognitive control: weak conversational skills, young children that have difficulty staying on topic, contributing appropriate amounts of information, structuring cohesive narratives about events. We know that children often drift off topic, and they often do not indicate when they don't understand something or when they don't know something. Greater environmental dependency. So here we're talking about the inappropriate use of objects in your environment, rule-guided behavior. This is relevant to using things like body diagrams or other interviewing aids to talk about events that may have happened. So in adults, some frontal lobe patients are highly dependent on their immediate environment. And that's a behavior that's clinically referred to as utilization, interacting with objects when it's inappropriate to do so, imitating other people's gestures. Young children tend to do that. Some young children tend to do that. Tendency to lose track of the purpose of conversations when reacting to external cues. Exploration, affordances, putting your fingers in the holes, things like that could be tied to environmental dependency. And I know I'm kind of going fast here, but trying to get through some of this. You can always go back and watch the recording. And really the last thing we're going to talk about is children's deception. And deception is, we don't like to think that children lie or that they would lie, but certainly we know that some children are capable of lying and some children do lie. And I think it's important, oftentimes lawyers and sometimes judges confuse deception and confabulation. So, of course, deception is intentional, right? When we lie, we intend to deceive. Confabulation, as I mentioned before, is a legitimate memory error, a false memory. So deception begins to emerge in the preschool years. Like adults, children lie for different reasons. Some of them are pro-social. We don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Or antisocial. You're trying to cover up a transgression. So there are different, just like adults, children have different motivations for lying. Children's ability to lie is related to developing theory of mind and executive functioning. So we talk about executive functioning and theory of mind. So theory of mind is understanding what other people are thinking or anticipating what they're thinking or they're going to think. And executive function we just talked about in terms of following rules, purposeful behavior, things like that. Younger children are not as skilled at maintaining lies, and they tend to leak information that reveals the truth. So for example, source monitoring if you're going to tell a lie, you have to remember who did you tell the lie to and what did you tell them. And of course, source monitoring improves with age. And so that's one reason why younger children are not as skilled in tend to leak cues that reveal the truth. There's no consistent verbal cues that reliably distinguish child liars from truth tellers. So very similar to the adult deception literature, there's no reliable behavioral profile that indicates deception. It's not to say that some behavioral indicators aren't more reliable than others, but there's no profile there's no go-to profile when trying to distinguish liars from truth tellers, and it's the same with kids. However, adults are better at identifying the lies of young children versus older children. And like adults, overall detection rates are around chance level. So that's just a little information about deception. Of course, there's a whole literature on children's deception. There's quite a bit of literature on how that deception is related to cognitive control and executive function. So in summary, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go kind of summarize what we've talked about so far, and then I'm going to talk about hypothesis testing. So in summary, even young children are capable of providing detailed and accurate reports of experienced events, but accuracy significantly declines when children are exposed to suggestive influences. Pre-interview conversations or exposure to misinformation through contact with adults or peers can contaminate children's subsequent reports in forensic interviews. Children's false reports often contain convincing contextual detail. Suggestibility does not have to be strong to influence children's reports. Bodily touching does not enjoy special resistance to suggestion, as some critics claim, and the effects of suggestibility on memory is not restricted to preschool-age children. Even older children are capable of producing convincing false reports after exposure to misinformation. And it's the same with adults. I mean, adults are generally less suggestible than children. That's certainly true, but that's not to say that suggestibility is not a concern with adults. For those of you who might follow the false confession literature, there's plenty of information demonstrating that very convincing false memories can be implanted in adults. The effects of suggestibility can be persistent even after long delays, and there's little evidence that the effects of suggestibility can be mitigated or that memory can be rehabilitated by a repeated forensic interview. Though open-ended questions are more likely to elicit accurate information from children than are specific questions, children's responses to open-ended questions are not necessarily accurate, especially when children have been exposed to suggestive influences. There is no evidence that experts can reliably distinguish between children's true and false statements. So one of the other kind of myths about suggestibility is, or forensic interviewing in general, is that, you know, even if you conduct a very good, well-executed forensic interview and you ask all the right questions, you've certainly maximized the likelihood that the children's statements are accurate and reliable, but just because you ask all the right questions and all of your questions are, none of your questions are leading or suggestive, that doesn't necessarily mean that the child's statements are accurate, or at least all of their statements are accurate. Suggestibility that takes place prior to the forensic interview is a concern, and as we've seen, suggestibility does not have to be strong to produce false reports in children. And I don't want to give the impression that children are inherently unreliable or that children can never be believed, but certainly it's at least my opinion that children are quite suggestible. Not all children all the time, but in general I would say that children are quite suggestible. And so that's something to at least consider when you're conducting your interview and you're testing alternative hypotheses. So I take issue with the kind of the notion that, you know, the research from 30 years ago is not applicable today. I mean, that's true to a certain extent, but to kind of wave off suggestibility is a concern because we have good interviewing protocols now, I think it's a little bit short-sighted. And one reason that one reason that an understanding of suggestibility is important is for hypothesis testing. I kind of want to talk real briefly about what I call the John Stossel question. So I've been to some forensic interviewing trainings where there's really very little training on alternative hypotheses or hypothesis testing or testing alternative explanations, however you want to say it. And there's a great video, it's about 20 minutes long from 2020, and it was done in the 80s or the 90s, and they interview Maggie Bruck and Steve Cece and Margaret Kelly Michaels, and it was right around kind of the daycare, cases. I guess that would be the early 90s. And at the end of the, they're talking about suggestibility and the research, and at the end of the segment, John Stossel's sitting at the news desk with Barbara Walters and the other news anchor there, and he talks about the importance of testing alternative hypotheses. And he says, for example, asking the child, did anyone else do this to you? He cites that as an example of an alternative hypothesis. And I'm pretty sure that some of these trainings have taken that, what John Stossel says at the end of the video, and they've really kind of concluded that that's what an alternative hypothesis is. And that's not exactly right. So Deb Poole has a new book out, and she talks about two different types of hypothesis testing, disambiguation and primary issues hypothesis testing. And these are both important for interviewers to be familiar with. And of course, the idea here is that in a forensic interview should not be hypothesis confirming. In other words, you don't want to go in and have your mind made up and you have a suspicion about what happened, and your goal is not to go in there and to necessarily confirm that's what happened. Right? You want to test alternative explanations, plausible explanations about what might have happened. And certainly that's easier in some cases than other cases. In some cases, there's an obvious alternative hypothesis. Sometimes there's not. But when we talk about disambiguation, we're talking about testing alternative interpretations for children's utterances or statements. So if a child said they are having sex, sometimes children, for example, will think that, to them that means that, that kissing is sex. So you want to ask, what is sex, or what happens when people have sex, or, you try to want to test the meaning of that word. That's disambiguation, or the name for a family member. You don't want to take it at face value that they're referring to their uncle. Primary issues hypothesis testing is testing plausible alternatives. And this can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily mean you're being skeptical of the child or skeptical of their accounts. But, for example, did the alleged touching take place during routine caretaking? And, of course, interview questions good questions that get at the context of the allegation are going to help determine whether there's an alternative explanation for what might have happened. And, again, sometimes this is easy, sometimes it's not, but certainly an understanding of pre-interview suggestibility in general can be helpful when it comes to testing alternative hypotheses. In Deb's book, she talks about the barriers to good hypothesis testing, and we're out of time, and you'll have to look at the book for more information about that. In any case, let me just click to the next slide. I do want to mention that Deb has a new book out that's very good, just came out. It's published by APA. A very readable book for students and interviewers alike. And I just want to also, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge your hard work that you do as forensic interviewers. I know most of you are interviewers, and believe me, the researchers know that it's a very, very difficult skill, and it's a very difficult job, and we do acknowledge that, and I thank you for your service for protecting children. And I hope to see you all at the 2017 NCAC conference this coming year. So thanks again. I'll take some questions. Also, last time in June, some people emailed me questions and I missed them. I was going through my email today, and I'm going to respond to those questions from June as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Jason, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to some questions here, and we can start with Justina. She says, hello, we have a question. What would be recommended to, oh, it went away. Hold on. What would be recommended to help police interviewers judge the quality of their interviews?
What would be helpful for police interviewers to judge the quality of their interviews?
Yes.
I mean, certainly, there are a lot of different things. One mistake that law enforcement makes when judging the quality of interviews, and it's not just children's interviews, but it's adult interviews as well, is when children where the witness is questioned on numerous occasions and new information comes out that wasn't provided in the prior interview. And we know that that's fairly common for both adults and children for things when they're interviewed a second time to talk about things they haven't talked about before. And there's a memory phenomenon referred to as reminiscence that explains that effect. So one thing I will say, it's a mistake for investigators to assume that when new information comes out, it's an indicator of deception from children. We know that that's not necessarily true. Another very important part of these investigations, and something I'm hoping to talk about at the upcoming NCAC conference, is statements provided by what's called the outcry or the first complaint or the fresh complaint witness. So in these investigations, obviously the child witness is very important. The police are going to interview the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. That's very important. But also, I think that police have to be very careful with the fresh complaint witness, which means interviewing the person that the child disclosed to, whether it's a peer, a parent, or a school nurse. Asking, it's kind of an afterthought, right? But asking the fresh complaint witness really good questions about the context of the allegation, and looking at if the context of the allegation is consistent with the child's statements in the interview, I think also can help judge the quality of that interview. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to identify a false report. Even trained experts are at chance level at identifying when a statement is false, and part of that is because false statements don't necessarily reflect deception. So that's another kind of thing for law enforcement to be worried about. And I'm actually married to a police officer, and police have a lot of confidence in their ability to kind of sort between liars and truth tellers, and so it's important to remember the distinction between confabulation and deception. So those are some general advice I might provide to police who are trying to evaluate the quality of children's reports.
Okay. Our next question is, are there any studies in the works about hypothesis testing?
Not that I know of, but that's a really good question, and not that I know of off the top of my head. I think that there's going to be some official policy coming out from some national training groups about hypothesis testing, and to that end, one thing I want to say is that sometimes defense attorneys will say that, well, you didn't ask, did this happen to somebody else, or did somebody else do this to you at the end of the interview, and therefore you failed to test alternative hypotheses. You know, I don't agree with that position. I think that that's I would just really kind of characterize that as a defense tactic. So I think that the policy that's going to be coming out is going to be talking about what's an alternative hypothesis and what's not, and certainly asking the child a bunch of specific questions if they know if this happened to somebody else or if anyone else did it to them. It does not constitute a hypothesis test. But that's a very good question. Certainly I think that there could be some very good field research looking at interview transcripts to see the frequency with which alternative hypotheses are asked, and do they fall into the categories of primary issues or disambiguation. And I'll really have to think about how maybe to do that in the laboratory. But I think, Rebecca, that you've really hit on a really interesting topic. Certainly the place to start is the laboratory study or the field studies.
Jason, do you have time for a few more questions, or do you have to be somewhere at 2:30?
No, I'm right here.
Okay, all right. We have another one. What advice do you have for therapists who work in CACs who may be called to testify in abuse cases or whose records may be subpoenaed? Specifically, what can they keep in mind when crafting invention questions, which are often quite different than forensically oriented questions?
Okay, let me, hi Tony, let me read that.
I was going to say, do you want to look at it in the chat box?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that, to be honest with you, Tony, I don't know a lot about the clinical work that goes on in CACs. I think it's important, and you obviously are aware, it's important that there are two roles. The role of clinician, and my understanding of clinical psychology is, right, to rehabilitate the psychological well-being of the client. The role of clinical psychology or therapy for a child who's been sexually abused is very different than the role of a forensic interviewer who is trying to elicit information in a decision-making capacity, you know, essentially to collect evidence and determine whether or not a crime's been committed and who's committed the crime. So I think that certainly educating the court about the differences between those two roles, and certainly it's important for clinicians to stay within their defined role. It's not to say that obviously a clinician could not conduct a forensic interview, but there's a big difference between a clinical interview and a forensic interview. That's really the best answer I can provide without knowing more about the therapeutic role in CACs. I'm assuming that most of the time in CACs, the therapy work takes place after the forensic interview, and I would also think that that would be a good general sequence of events. I'm familiar with a case right now where there's a judge who there's questions about the reliability of the forensic interview, and the judge is insisting on a clinician who doesn't have interviewing expertise, but the judge is insisting on a clinician come in and talk about the reliability of the interview from a clinical perspective. And I think if you're talking about child abuse accommodation syndrome, there could be some relevance there, but certainly the decisions that are made as an outcome of a forensic interview are generally not diagnostic as they would be